not normal to see Piazza Santa Maria Novella this empty on a beautiful day in spring, in mid-May. But this is what's happened thanks to the pandemic that swept our world. No students, no tourists. But this is nothing new to Florence. We know that in 1348, a plague swept this city. The Black Death, it's called, because nearly half the citizens of Florence were swept away in that terrible pandemic those years ago. But there's something that came out of that. A new world came out of that. The Renaissance was born out of that. And one author in particular, Giovanni Boccaccio, was very important as an architect of that new Renaissance. His book, the Decameron, was written just after the plague. And the introduction to the Decameron tells the story of what happened to the city of Florence during that plague. It's not a pretty picture. A breakdown of society, institutions, the church, the police, the government falling apart. Family bonds, the most intimate of relations we have with our loved ones, fall apart. Fathers forget sons. Mothers don't care about their daughters anymore. Cadavers are on the street. Fortunately, our times are not nearly as dire as these, but there's a lesson we can learn from Giovanni Boccaccio and his story of the plague. It's how he rebuilt, how the Decameron is a story of rebuilding on the ruins of what came before, finding in the past the elements that can create the future. And so let's consider a little bit Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, about how we, as a model for how we can emerge from this. Boccaccio lived a very carefree life up until the plague hit in Florence. Born of a rich but not noble family, in Florence he lived many years happy here before moving with his family and the bank that they worked for to Naples, where he found a French-influenced court that was the paramount court of all of Europe of those days. The courtly culture was great. French, Italian, Latin, Greek, all were present there, and Boccaccio learned in this atmosphere and brought that back to him, with him, as he came to Florence with his family after the failure of the bank. While the introduction to the Decameron tells the story of the plague and the city's reaction to it, the Decameron itself is made up of 100 stories, told over 10 days by 10 young men and women who flee the town to find respite from the plague in the surrounding Tuscan hills. And while the plague story in the introduction is dire, sad, scary, the stories told by the youth are happy, cheerful, sometimes sad. And sure, monks sometimes sleep with nuns. But they're a story of human life. They're a record of what came before the plague and what can come after. The miracle of the Decameron is that in the face of so much death, so much devastation, an author like Giovanni Boccaccio can remember the beauty of what came before and imagine the beauty of what came after. His story is populated by many Florentines, Tuscans, Italians, Europeans, all of whom by the time Boccaccio is telling these stories are dead, many of whom were taken away by the plague. Umana cos'è avere compassione dei afflitti. It is a human thing to have compassion for those who suffer. These are the words with which Boccaccio begins the Decameron. They attest to the point of this work, compassion for those suffering, the building of a new society from the ruins of the old. And when his 10 young men and women, 7 women, 3 young men, flee Florence and come to a beautiful villa in the countryside and tell their stories in a beautiful garden much like this outside of the city, we should have compassion for them, for the suffering they're going to have. We should have compassion for the characters who would die during the plague and in the years in Florence. But we must remember what happens afterwards. That these 10 young men, 7 young men, and 3 young women return to Florence. They don't live the rest of their lives in isolation. They continue to interact with society, and they build a new society, and they realize that society is built on these connections between humans, one and another. This humanity that is restored through the storytelling, through the removal to the garden, through the removal to nature. So the story of the Decameron is not one of lockdown, shutdown, isolation, quarantine. The story is return, renewal, and rebirth. We read the Decameron not just to hear about the plague, but we read the Decameron as an example of the beauty that can come out of tragedy, of the strength that emerges from a moment of fear. And hopefully, the Decameron can be a lesson for us as we emerge ourselves from this difficult time, and we imagine what Florence will be like for us in the future.